A scorching sun hung like a merciless judge in the vast New Mexico sky as Preston Vale squinted at the shimmering horizon, wondering if what he saw was real or just another mirage playing tricks on his weary eyes. The year was 1876, and the unforgiving desert stretched before him like a sea of burning sand, hostile to all but the most resilient souls. Preston adjusted his worn leather hat, providing meager shade to his sun-weathered face as he guided his chestnut stallion, Thunder, toward the distant shape that had caught his attention. "What do you reckon, boy?" He murmured to his horse, the only companion he'd had for the past 3 weeks since leaving Sweetwater, New Mexico. The small ranching town had been his home for the past year, but the open plains kept calling him back, a restlessness in his blood that wouldn't let him settle for too long. As he drew closer, the shape on the horizon took form, a figure sprawled on the sand. Preston's heart quickened. Out here, finding another soul could mean trouble as often as it meant company, but something about the stillness of the form sent him spurring Thunder forward. The sight that greeted him knocked the breath from his lungs. A woman lay unconscious on the baked earth, her dress torn and dusty, her face flushed an alarming red against skin that should have been pale. Long auburn hair spilled across the sand like copper wire catching the sun. She wasn't moving. Preston dismounted in a fluid motion born from years in the saddle, his spurs jingling as he knelt beside her. "Madam," he called, touching her shoulder gently. No response. He placed 2 fingers against her neck and felt a flutter, weak but present. "Thank God," he breathed. Her skin burned hot to the touch, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. She was alive, but wouldn't be for long in this heat. Without hesitation, Preston scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp as a rag doll. There wasn't a drop of water or hint of shade for miles, and Sweetwater was at least a day's ride away. The nearest water source he knew of was Eagle Creek, about 5 miles east. It wasn't much, but it was her only chance. "Hang on," he whispered to the unconscious woman as he carefully lifted her onto Thunder's back, then mounted behind her, supporting her body against his chest. "We'll get you to water." The woman stirred slightly, a small moan escaping her cracked lips, but her eyes remained closed. Preston urged Thunder into a careful trot, mindful of his precious cargo. Each jolt seemed to cause the woman pain, but staying in this desert would kill her for certain. As they rode, Preston studied her face. Despite the sunburn and dust, he could tell she was beautiful, with delicate features and long lashes that cast shadows on her cheekbones. She wore a simple dress that had once been fine, the kind city women wore, not the practical garments of frontier women. A gold locket hung around her neck, somehow untouched by whatever hardship had left her stranded in the desert. "What's your story?" he wondered aloud, knowing she couldn't answer. "What brings a lady like you out to this God-forsaken place?" The journey to Eagle Creek seemed endless. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Preston shared his last precious water with the unconscious woman, dribbling small amounts between her parched lips, watching with relief as her throat worked to swallow. He kept his broad-brimmed hat tilted to shade her face as much as possible, his own skin burning under the relentless sun. By the time the creek came into view, a thin green line in the distance promising salvation, Preston's shirt was soaked with sweat, and the woman's breathing had become shallow and labored. Thunder, sensing water ahead, quickened his pace. The creek was little more than a trickle this time of year, but it was clean and cool. Preston dismounted carefully, cradling the woman in his arms, and carried her to the bank. He laid her gently in the shade of a cottonwood tree, then soaked his bandana in the creek and began to bathe her face, neck, and wrists. "Come on, darlin'," he murmured, the endearment slipping out unconsciously. "Come back to me now." After what seemed like hours of patient care, the woman's eyelashes fluttered. Preston held his breath as her eyes opened slowly, revealing irises the color of prairie sage after rain. She blinked in confusion, then focused on his face with alarm. "Easy now," Preston said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. I found you passed out in the desert, brought you to water." She tried to speak but coughed instead, her throat too dry for words. Preston helped her sit up just enough to take small sips from his canteen. Thank you, she managed finally, her voice raspy but cultured, confirming his suspicion she wasn't from around these parts. Preston Vale, he introduced himself with a small nod. Ranch hand from Sweetwater, she hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust him with her name. Grace, she finally said. Grace Jameson, Miss Jameson, Preston acknowledged. Can you tell me how you ended up alone in the desert? Grace's eyes clouded with what looked like fear. I was traveling. The stagecoach was robbed, the driver and guard were shot, the passengers. Her voice broke. I just ran. Preston's jaw tightened. Stagecoach robberies weren't uncommon, but they didn't usually end in massacre. How long ago? Yesterday morning, I think. I lost track of time. She looked down at her hands, which were scratched and dirty. I thought I could find help, but I got disoriented. The heat. She shook her head, then winced at the movement. You're lucky to be alive, Miss Jameson, Preston said gravely. Wandering the desert in this heat without water, most don't survive a day. Then I suppose I'm in your debt, Mr. Vale, she replied, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. No debt between us, he assured her. Just glad I happened along when I did. He didn't mention that he rarely took this route, that something perhaps Providence had guided him this way today. Grace tried to sit up further but swayed dangerously. Preston steadied her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. Easy, you need rest and more water before you try moving around. Where are we? She asked, looking around at the sparse vegetation surrounding the small creek. Eagle Creek. It's about a day's ride from Sweetwater, Preston explained. Not much to look at, but it's water. We'll camp here tonight, get your strength back, then head to town tomorrow if you're able. Grace nodded weakly, then her face crumpled. My belongings. Everything I had was in my trunk on that coach. Preston understood what she wasn't saying. A woman alone in the West with no money or possessions had few options, none of them good. We'll figure something out, he promised, though he wasn't sure how. His own circumstances were modest at best. As the day's heat began to wane, Preston set about making camp. He unsaddled Thunder, letting the horse drink and graze, then gathered what dry wood he could find to build a small fire. From his saddlebags, he produced jerky, hardtack, and coffee trail rations that weren't fancy but would sustain them. Grace watched him work, her color slowly improving as she sipped water and rested in the shade. By the time the fire was crackling and coffee brewing in his battered pot, she had managed to sit up properly, her back against the cottonwood trunk. Are you feeling up to eating something? Preston asked, offering her a piece of jerky. She accepted it with a grateful nod. I never thought dried meat could look so appealing, she admitted, taking a small bite. Hunger's the best seasoning, Preston replied with a half smile, though I apologize for the lack of proper dinner. Wasn't expecting company on this trip. Where were you headed? Grace asked between careful bites. Preston poured coffee into his single tin cup and handed it to her. Nowhere particular, just scouting. I work for the Double R Ranch outside Sweetwater. Owner sent me to check if the grazing lands to the south might be usable, given the drought. You were alone. There was something in her tone, concern, perhaps, or surprise at the idea of someone willingly facing the desert's solitude. I prefer it that way most times, he admitted. Gets complicated with other folks around. Grace studied him over the rim of the coffee cup. You're an interesting man, Mr. Vale. Most would consider it dangerous to travel alone in such territory. Preston shrugged. Been doing it since I was 16. Know the land, know the dangers. Indians in these parts are mostly peaceful if you respect their territories. Outlaws are a concern, but they usually stick closer to the stage routes. He paused, realizing his words might remind her of her trauma. I'm sorry about what happened to you. It was horrible, she said quietly. They didn't need to kill anyone. The passengers gave up their valuables willingly. Some men don't need reasons to be cruel, Preston replied grimly. Did you get a look at them? Might help the sheriff identify the gang. Grace shook her head. They wore bandanas over their faces, but... She hesitated. One had a scar across his hand like a burn, and another called him Digger. Preston's expression darkened. The Blackburn gang, they've been terrorizing the territory for months now. Sheriff's been after them, but they know these badlands better than most. As night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically, the way it always did in the desert. Grace began to shiver despite the fire. Without a word, Preston removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "I can't take your coat," she protested weakly. "I'm used to the cold," he insisted. "Desert nights don't bother me much anymore." Grace pulled the coat tighter, inhaling the scent of leather, horse, and something uniquely male that she found oddly comforting. "Thank you for everything." Preston nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Get some rest, Miss Jameson. We have a long ride tomorrow." "Grace," she corrected him softly. "Please call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, and the way her name sounded in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest despite her exhaustion. As she drifted towards sleep, wrapped in his coat beside the fire, Grace wondered about the quiet cowboy who had saved her life. There was a gentleness in his rough hands that contradicted his weathered exterior, a kindness in his eyes that spoke of a good heart beneath the stoic facade. In her last moments of consciousness, she found herself grateful not just for her rescue, but for the rescuer himself. Preston watched her sleep for a time, troubled by her story and by the strange protective feeling that had settled in his chest. He'd saved injured calves and stranded travelers before, but something about this woman stirred emotions he'd long thought buried. Perhaps it was her courage in the face of such trauma, or the trust she placed in him despite her ordeal. Whatever the reason, as Preston finally lay down on his bedroll, stars wheeling overhead in the vast desert sky, he knew with certainty that his life had changed irrevocably the moment he spotted her form on the horizon. Dawn arrived with the first tentative rays of sunlight painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Preston was already awake, having slept lightly as he always did in the open country. He rekindled the fire and put coffee on to boil, moving quietly to avoid waking Grace. She stirred anyway, perhaps roused by the scent of coffee or some internal awareness that it was morning. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding them for a moment before recognition dawned. "Good morning," Preston said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. Grace sat up carefully, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. "Good morning," she replied, her own voice stronger than it had been the previous day. "I hope I didn't sleep too late." "Sun's barely up," he assured her, pouring coffee into the tin cup and passing it to her. "How are you feeling?" She took a moment to assess herself. "Better, still weak, but my head isn't pounding anymore." She sipped the strong black coffee gratefully. "I think I can ride today." Preston nodded, satisfied with her progress. "We'll take it slow. It's about 20 miles to Sweetwater. If you start feeling poorly, you tell me right away." "I will," she promised. Then, after a pause, "What will happen when we reach town?" It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. A woman alone, without resources, had limited options in a frontier town. Preston considered his words carefully. "There's a boarding house run by Mrs. Holloway. Decent place. She might take you in, maybe let you work to cover your room and board until you decide what you want to do." He hesitated. "I'd offer you a place at the bunkhouse, but it wouldn't be proper." Grace smiled at that, appreciating his concern for her reputation even in such circumstances. "I understand. Mrs. Holloway sounds like a good option." After a simple breakfast of the remaining jerky and hardtack, Preston packed up their modest camp while Grace washed her face and hands in the creek, attempting to make herself somewhat presentable. He pretended not to notice as she tried to smooth her wrinkled dress and tame her tangled hair with her fingers. When it came time to mount up, Preston approached the matter delicately. "Thunder's a good horse, but he's only got one saddle. We'll have to ride double." Grace nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks despite her pragmatism. "Of course, whatever's necessary." Preston helped her mount first, then swung up behind her with practiced ease. There was no way to avoid the intimacy of the arrangement, her back pressed against his chest, his arms around her to hold the reins. He tried to maintain as much proper distance as possible, but the saddle allowed for little space between them. "Ready?" he asked, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. Yes, she replied, her voice steady despite the strange flutter in her stomach at his proximity. They set off at a gentle pace, Preston guiding Thunder carefully to avoid jarring his passenger. The desert stretched around them, beautiful in its stark simplicity, the morning light giving the landscape a golden glow that softened its harshness. Grace had never been this close to a man for such an extended period. She could feel the solid strength of him behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the occasional shift of his muscles as he adjusted the reins or reached for his canteen. It was disconcerting and yet oddly comforting. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Vale?" She ventured after they had ridden in companionable silence for some time. "Preston," he corrected, echoing her own request from the night before, "and yes, though I can't promise to answer. How does someone like you end up alone in the desert? You're clearly educated despite your occupation." Preston was silent for so long that Grace thought he might have decided not to answer after all. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if he was carefully choosing his words. "I was studying law back east, Boston. My father was a judge, had my whole life planned out." The bitterness in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. "Then the war came. I enlisted, served 4 years with the Union Army, saw things no man should see." Grace remained quiet, sensing there was more to the story. "When I came home, everything had changed, or maybe I had. Couldn't stand the walls closing in, the endless social obligations, the pretense of it all." He took a breath. "Headed west the day after my father's funeral, been moving ever since until Sweetwater, stayed there longer than anywhere else." "I'm sorry about your father," Grace said softly. "Don't be, we weren't close." The finality in his tone discouraged further questions on that subject. "What about you? What brings a lady like yourself to the New Mexico territory alone?" Now it was Grace's turn to fall silent, weighing how much to reveal. "I was a schoolteacher in Philadelphia," she began. "My situation there became untenable. I answered an advertisement for a teaching position in Silver City." "Untenable," Preston repeated, the word hanging between them like a question. Grace sighed. "My father died 2 years ago, leaving considerable debts. The family home was sold, and I was forced to make my own way. The school where I taught was acquired by a new headmaster who made it clear that certain accommodations would be expected if I wished to keep my position." Preston's body tensed behind her. "I see. I refused, of course. He dismissed me and worse, spread rumors that damaged my reputation. No school in Philadelphia would hire me." Her voice had grown tight with anger and humiliation. "I had an aunt in Silver City who wrote that they needed teachers desperately. It seemed like Providence." "And now?" Preston asked quietly. Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And now I'm penniless, possessionless, and at the mercy of strangers in a town I've never heard of." "Providence has a strange sense of humor. Sweetwater's not much, but it's a decent place," Preston said after a moment. "People look after their own, but I'm not one of their own," Grace pointed out. "You will be," he replied with a certainty that surprised her. "Besides, the town could use a proper teacher. School's been closed since Miss Winters ran off with the blacksmith last spring." The idea sparked a glimmer of hope in Grace's heart. "Do you really think they might hire me, without references or credentials? I have nothing to prove my qualifications." "Folks around here care more about whether you can do the job than what papers you carry," Preston assured her. "And if you're half as smart as you sound, you'll have no trouble proving yourself." The conversation drifted to other topics as the day wore on. Preston pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the region, from Apache legends to tales of Spanish explorers. Grace found herself entranced not just by the stories, but by the storyteller. Behind his reserved exterior was a mind as vast as the landscape around them, filled with knowledge gleaned from books and experience in equal measure. By midday, the sun was high and merciless. Preston called a halt in a small patch of shade offered by a jutting rock formation. He helped Grace dismount, steadying her when her legs wobbled after hours in the saddle. "Need to rest?" he asked, concern evident in his eyes. "Just for a few minutes," she admitted. "I'm not accustomed to riding for so long." They shared water and the last of the provisions while Thunder rested nearby. Grace couldn't help noticing how Preston took only the smallest portion for himself, ensuring she had enough to regain her strength. "Tell me about Sweetwater," she requested as they sat in the meager shade. "What kind of place is it?" Preston considered the question. "Small, maybe 300 souls. Got a main street with the usual businesses: general store, saloon, small hotel, church doubles as the schoolhouse. Ranch country mostly, though there's talk of a silver vein nearby that might bring miners eventually." He paused. "It's quiet for the most part. Sheriff Jenkins keeps order well enough." "It sounds peaceful," Grace remarked. "Mostly is," Preston agreed, "though we have our share of excitement. Last month, old Tobias Mackenzie's prize bull got loose and charged through Mrs. Holloway's kitchen. Never seen a woman so mad or a bull so frightened afterward." The story startled a genuine laugh from Grace, the sound bright and unexpected in the vast silence of the desert. Preston found himself smiling in response, struck by how the simple joy transformed her face, bringing life and color to features still marked by exhaustion. "I like that," he said without thinking. "What, your laugh?" The admission seemed to surprise him as much as her. He quickly looked away, suddenly finding the distant mountains fascinating. "We should get moving, still a ways to go." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them. As they continued their journey, the silence felt different, charged with an awareness that hadn't been there before. The landscape began to change subtly as they rode on, the barren desert giving way to scattered vegetation. Clumps of hardy grasses appeared, then occasional mesquite bushes and stunted junipers. By late afternoon, they crested a gentle rise, and Preston pulled Thunder to a halt. "There it is," he said, gesturing to the valley below. "Sweetwater." Grace leaned forward slightly to take in the view. The town was indeed small, just a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley with a ribbon of green marking the course of the river that gave the settlement its name. Surrounding the town were ranches and farms, small patches of civilization carved out of the wilderness. "It's lovely," she said sincerely, finding beauty in the modest settlement and its setting. "It grows on you," Preston admitted, urging Thunder forward down the slope. "Not much to look at compared to Philadelphia, I'd wager." "After 2 days in the desert, it looks like paradise," Grace assured him. As they approached the outskirts of town, Grace became increasingly aware of her appearance. Her once fine dress was tattered and dusty, her hair a tangled mess, her skin sunburned and wind-chapped. What would the townsfolk think of her arriving in such a state, riding double with Preston? As if sensing her thoughts, Preston spoke. "Folks here understand the hardships of the frontier. No one will think less of you for looking trail-worn after what you've been through." His words eased her anxiety somewhat, though she still felt self-conscious as they rode down the main street. It was late afternoon, and the town was quietly active. Men and women went about their business, pausing to stare at the unusual sight of Preston returning with a woman. They stopped in front of a 2-story clapboard building with a sign reading "Holloway Boarding House" in neat painted letters. Before Preston could dismount, the door opened, and a stout woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Preston Vale, as I live and breathe," she called, her sharp eyes taking in the scene before her. "Didn't expect you back for another week, and certainly not with company." Preston tipped his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Miss Grace Jameson. She was on the Silver City stage when it was robbed. Found her in the desert yesterday, suffering from heat exposure. She needs a place to stay." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened immediately as she looked at Grace with concern. "You poor dear. Of course you'll stay here. Come in, come in. We need to get you cooled down and fed properly." Preston dismounted first, then helped Grace down. Her legs nearly buckled as they touched the ground, and he caught her around the waist, steadying her against him. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up into his face, suddenly aware of how close they were. For a moment neither moved, caught in some unspoken current of feeling. Then Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat pointedly, breaking the spell. "Well, don't just stand there, Preston. Bring the lady inside while I have Betsy prepare a bath. She looks dead on her feet." Preston released Grace reluctantly, keeping a supportive hand under her elbow as they followed Mrs. Holloway into the boarding house. The interior was clean and modestly furnished, with a comfortable parlor and a dining room visible through an archway. Miss Jameson has had a terrible ordeal, Preston explained as they entered. The stage was attacked by the Blackburn gang, everyone else. He let the sentence hang, not wanting to upset Grace by recounting the details. Mrs. Holloway's face hardened. Those scoundrels, sheriff's been after them for months. She turned to Grace with motherly concern. You're safe now, dear, we'll get you settled and comfortable, Betsy. She called toward the back of the house. Prepare a bath in the blue room and bring up some of my lavender soap. A young girl of about 14 appeared, eyes widening at the sight of the newcomers. Yes, madam, she said, then scurried off to obey. Now, as for payment, Mrs. Holloway continued, turning back to them. I understand you've lost your belongings, so we'll work something out. Perhaps you have skills that could be useful around the house. Before Grace could respond, Preston spoke up. Put her room on my account, Mrs. Holloway, at least until she gets settled. Both women stared at him in surprise. Grace was the first to recover. That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly. It's settled, Preston interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Mrs. Holloway, see that she gets whatever she needs. Clothes, toiletries, meals, I'll cover it. The older woman studied him with a knowing look that made him shift uncomfortably. Very well, Preston, though I never took you for the gallant type before. Just doing what's right, he muttered, suddenly eager to escape the women's scrutiny. I should see to Thunder. He's had a long journey carrying double. Of course, Mrs. Holloway said, a hint of amusement in her voice. We'll take good care of Miss Jameson. Preston turned to Grace, seeming uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. You'll be all right here, Mrs. Holloway runs the finest boarding house in the territory. The only boarding house in 50 miles, the older woman corrected dryly. I don't know how to thank you, Grace said, looking up at Preston with genuine emotion. You saved my life. No need for thanks, he replied awkwardly. I'll check on you tomorrow, see how you're settling in. Then, with a nod to Mrs. Holloway and a last lingering look at Grace, he turned and left, his spurs jingling softly as he walked out the door. As soon as he was gone, Mrs. Holloway turned to Grace with undisguised curiosity. Well now, that's the most words I've heard from Preston Vale in the 2 years he's lived here. You must have made quite an impression during your journey. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with her sunburn. He was very kind to me. I owe him my life. Yes, well, kindness is one thing. Paying for a lady's room and board is quite another. Mrs. Holloway smiled knowingly. But we can discuss that later. First, let's get you that bath and some fresh clothes. You look about my niece's size. She left some dresses here last time she visited. Nothing fancy, mind you, but clean and whole. As Mrs. Holloway ushered her upstairs, chattering about dinner arrangements and introducing her to the other boarders, Grace found her thoughts drifting back to Preston. The stoic cowboy who'd carried her miles to safety, who'd treated her with nothing but respect and kindness, who just arranged for her care without a second thought. For the first time since the stagecoach robbery, she felt something besides fear and despair. It was a strange, fluttering sensation in her chest, part gratitude, part something else she wasn't ready to name. Whatever it was, as she sank into the first hot bath she'd had in days, Grace Jameson realized that her arrival in Sweetwater might be the beginning of something unexpected, rather than the desperate last resort she'd feared. The next morning, Grace awoke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the past days crashed back into her consciousness, and she sat up, taking stock of her situation. She was alive, thanks to Preston Vale. She was clean, comfortably dressed in a borrowed calico day dress, and well fed after Mrs. Holloway's substantial dinner the night before. She was safe for now, though her future remained uncertain. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Jameson. Breakfast is ready downstairs, came Betsy's young voice. Thank you, Betsy. I'll be right down, Grace called back, rising to quickly arrange her hair. Mrs. Holloway had lent her a brush and pins the night before, allowing her to restore some order to her appearance. Downstairs, The dining room was occupied by several other boarders, a young clerk from the general store, an elderly widower who nodded politely at her entrance, and a middle-aged couple who introduced themselves as the Petersons, in town waiting for their new house to be completed. "Miss Jameson has had quite an ordeal," Mrs. Holloway announced as she served generous portions of eggs and biscuits. She was the sole survivor of the Silver City stage robbery. Preston Vale found her in the desert and brought her to us. The boarders expressed appropriate shock and sympathy, but Grace noticed how their eyes lit with curiosity at the mention of Preston's involvement. Clearly, the cowboy's actions were considered noteworthy. "Such a tragedy," Mrs. Peterson clucked. "Those Blackburn boys need to be strung up, every last one of them." "The sheriff's doing his best," Mr. Peterson assured his wife, "but they know the Badlands better than anyone. Hard to track them out there." "Well, at least some good came of it, Mrs. Holloway said, glancing meaningfully at Grace. "Preston bringing Miss Jameson to us. I hear she's a schoolteacher. Heaven knows Sweetwater needs one." Grace looked up in surprise. "How did you know I was a teacher?" Mrs. Holloway smiled. "Preston stopped by early this morning. Mentioned you might be interested in the position. Said I should tell Mayor Collins." "Oh," Grace wasn't sure whether to be touched or disturbed that Preston had been discussing her prospects without consulting her. "I would certainly be interested, though I have no references or credentials with me." "References?" Mrs. Holloway scoffed. "Out here, we care more about capability than papers. The children have been running wild since Miss Winters left. Parents would hire just about anyone with basic literacy at this point." After breakfast, Mrs. Holloway insisted that Grace rest, but she was too restless to stay confined to her room. After assuring her hostess that she felt much recovered, Grace ventured out to explore the town. Sweetwater was indeed small, but it had a certain charm. The main street boasted a general store, a combined barber and bathhouse, a small hotel, the sheriff's office, and the Silver Dollar Saloon. Beyond these businesses were modest homes, a church with an attached schoolhouse, and at the far end of town, a blacksmith shop where the rhythmic clanging of hammer on anvil provided a steady backdrop to the day's activities. As Grace walked, she was aware of curious glances from townspeople. News traveled fast in small communities, and clearly, everyone knew who she was and how she'd arrived. Some nodded politely, others approached to introduce themselves, expressing sympathy for her ordeal and welcome to the town. She was standing outside the general store, admiring a display of fabrics in the window and mentally calculating how many teaching wages it might take to afford a new dress, when a voice behind her made her turn. "You look better today." Preston stood there, hat in hand, looking surprisingly cleaned up compared to their time in the desert. He'd shaved, and his clothes, while still workmanlike, were fresh. His dark hair, freed from his hat, curled slightly at the temples where it needed trimming. "Mr. Vale," she greeted him, suddenly conscious of the borrowed dress and her simple hairstyle. "Yes, a night in a real bed works wonders. Preston," he reminded her. "I'm glad Mrs. Holloway's taking good care of you. She's been very kind," Grace agreed. "She mentioned you spoke to her about the teaching position." He shifted his weight, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Hope you don't mind. Thought it might help to get the word out early." "I don't mind at all. It was thoughtful of you." She studied him for a moment. "Though I'm not sure how I feel about you paying for my room and board. It's too much, especially from someone who's already saved my life." Preston shook his head. "It's nothing. I don't have much use for money out at the ranch. Room and board are covered, and I've saved most of my wages. Still, I insist on repaying you once I secure employment." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "You're stubborn." "I prefer determined," Grace replied, returning his almost smile. "Miss Jameson." A booming voice interrupted their exchange as a portly, well-dressed man approached from across the street. "I'm Mayor Collins. So pleased to meet you, despite the unfortunate circumstances." Grace turned to greet the newcomer, noting how Preston took a subtle step back, yielding the conversation. "Mayor Collins, it's a pleasure," she said, extending her hand. The mayor pumped it enthusiastically. "Mrs. Holloway tells me you're a school teacher. Providence, that's what it is. We've been without one since spring." The children are running wild and parents are at their wits' end. I would be very interested in discussing the position, Grace confirmed. Excellent, the town council meets tonight at 7. Can you attend? We can interview you properly then. Nothing formal, you understand, just a chance to meet everyone and discuss terms. That would be perfect, Grace agreed, hope blossoming in her chest. Perhaps her situation wasn't as dire as she'd feared. Wonderful, at the church then. Preston, you'll escort Miss Jameson, won't you? The mayor didn't wait for an answer before continuing. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to notify the council members. With a tip of his hat, Mayor Collins hurried off, leaving Grace and Preston in a moment of awkward silence. You don't have to escort me, Grace said finally. I'm sure I can find my way. It's no trouble, Preston replied, then hesitating slightly, unless you'd prefer I didn't. No, that's not, Grace stopped, frustrated by her own inarticulateness. What I mean is, you've done so much already, I don't want to impose further. It's not an imposition, he said simply. Something in his steady gaze made her heart beat a little faster. Then I'd be grateful for your company, she admitted. Preston nodded, seemingly satisfied. I'll call for you at 7:15. With that, he settled his hat back on his head, touched the brim in a polite gesture, and turned to go. Grace watched him walk away, puzzled by the enigmatic cowboy who'd upended her life so completely in just 2 days. The rest of the day passed quickly as Grace explored more of the town and prepared for her interview. Mrs. Holloway helped her press the borrowed dress and even lent her a cameo brooch to add a touch of respectability to her appearance. The town counsels mostly for show, Mrs. Holloway confided as she pinned the brooch to Grace's collar. Mayor Collins makes most decisions, but he likes the formality of it. The other members are Dr. Wallace, Mr. Peterson from the general store, Mrs. Abernathy who owns the hotel, and Reverend Thomas. Are they likely to be difficult to convince? Grace asked nervously. Mrs. Holloway snorted. Honey, you could recite the alphabet and they'd hire you. They're desperate. Just be yourself and you'll be fine. True to his word, Preston arrived at 7:15. He'd made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean shirt under his vest and his best pants, though he still looked more comfortable in the saddle than in a social setting. You look nice, he said simply as Grace descended the stairs. Thank you. She felt a blush rising to her cheeks at the honest compliment. Shall we go? The church was a modest white clapboard building with a small steeple. Inside, the pews had been arranged in a circle at the front where 5 people sat in conversation. They looked up as Grace and Preston entered. Mayor Collins rose immediately. Ah, Miss Jameson, right on time, and Preston, good to see you. Please join us. Grace was surprised when Preston followed her to the front rather than taking a seat in the back as she'd expected. As introductions were made, she noted how the council members treated him with respect, if not quite as an equal. There was a subtle class distinction at play that she recognized from her Eastern upbringing. Preston was valued for his skills and character, but was still a ranch hand in a setting of business owners and professionals. The interview itself was remarkably straightforward. The council asked about her educational background, teaching experience, and approach to discipline. They seemed impressed by her 5 years of teaching in Philadelphia and her education at a women's seminary in Boston. The position pays $40 a month, Mayor Collins explained. The school term runs September through May with holidays for Christmas and Easter. There are currently 27 children of school age in town, ranging from 6 to 16 years. The living arrangements are simple but adequate, Mrs. Abernathy added. There's a small cabin behind the schoolhouse for the teacher. Basic furnishings are provided. Grace's heart leapt at the mention of her own accommodations. It would mean independence, not having to rely on Preston's charity or work off her debt to Mrs. Holloway. When would you want me to start? She asked. As soon as possible, Reverend Thomas replied earnestly. Perhaps next Monday. That would give you time to review the curriculum and prepare the schoolhouse. I believe I could manage that, Grace agreed, struggling to contain her excitement. The council members exchanged glances, then Mayor Collins smiled broadly. Well, I think we've heard enough. Unless anyone has objections, I move that we offer Miss Jameson the position of schoolteacher for Sweetwater, effective immediately." The vote was unanimous, and just like that, Grace found herself employed. As the meeting concluded with handshakes all around, she could hardly believe how quickly her fortunes had turned, from near death in the desert to a position and home of her own in less than 3 days. As they walked back to the boarding house in the deepening twilight, Grace couldn't contain her happiness. "I can't believe how smoothly that went. In Philadelphia, such a position would require multiple interviews, letters of recommendation, and endless scrutiny." Preston smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually solemn face. "Told you it would work out. Sweetwater needed a teacher and you needed a fresh start. Simple as that." "Nothing's ever that simple," Grace countered, though her tone was light. "Out here it can be," Preston insisted. "The West has a way of stripping things down to essentials. A person is judged by what they can do and who they are, not by their past or their papers." "Is that why you stayed?" she asked, genuinely curious. "After all your wandering," Preston considered the question. "Partly. Sweetwater's a good place. People mind their business but help when needed. No one asks too many questions about where you came from or why." They had reached the boarding house, but neither made a move to enter. Instead, they stood in the soft glow of the lamplight from the windows, reluctant to end the evening. "I want to thank you properly," Grace said finally, "for saving my life, for bringing me here, for helping me secure this position. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't found me in the desert." "You don't need to thank me," Preston replied, suddenly looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't," Grace insisted. "Many would have left me there or worse." She shuddered slightly at the thought. "You're a good man, Preston Vale, whether you acknowledge it or not." Their eyes met in the dim light, and something passed between them, an unspoken recognition of the connection that had formed during their brief acquaintance. For a moment, Grace thought he might say something more, might even reach for her hand. But the moment passed and Preston took a step back, breaking the spell. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "Been a big day." "Yes, of course." Grace tried to hide her disappointment at the abrupt end to their conversation. "Will I see you again before I move to the teacher's cabin?" "I'll be around," Preston assured her. "Ranch keeps me busy, but I'm in town most Saturdays for supplies." With that, he tipped his hat and turned to go, leaving Grace to watch his retreating figure until it disappeared into the darkness. Only then did she enter the boarding house, where Mrs. Holloway waited with barely concealed curiosity about the outcome of the meeting. As Grace recounted the interview and her new position, she couldn't help wondering about the mysterious cowboy who had so dramatically altered her life's course. There was more to Preston Vale than met the eye, a depth of character and intelligence that intrigued her. Despite her practical nature, Grace found herself hoping that their paths would continue to cross in the small town of Sweetwater. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Grace. The town rallied around their new schoolteacher with typical frontier generosity. Mrs. Peterson from the general store donated fabric for new curtains in the teacher's cabin. Dr. Wallace's wife provided kitchenware. The blacksmith repaired the cabin's stove, and Reverend Thomas's wife organized a group of women to thoroughly clean the schoolhouse, which had gathered dust over the summer months. By Saturday, Grace was ready to move into her new home. The teacher's cabin was indeed small, just one main room with a curtained-off sleeping area, a cast-iron stove for cooking and heat, a small table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the window. But it was clean and bright, with new gingham curtains and a colorful quilt on the narrow bed. Most importantly, it was hers. Mrs. Holloway insisted on hosting a small tea to introduce Grace properly to the mothers of her future pupils. The affair was modest by Philadelphia standards, but represented significant effort in Sweetwater. The boarding house parlor was decorated with fresh wildflowers, and Mrs. Holloway's best china was brought out for the occasion. As Grace circulated among the women, answering questions about her teaching philosophy and listening to concerned mothers describe their children's strengths and weaknesses, She caught herself glancing occasionally at the door. She hadn't seen Preston since the night of her interview, and though she told herself it was ridiculous to expect him to attend a ladies' tea, she couldn't help feeling a twinge of disappointment at his absence. "He's not much for social gatherings," a voice said beside her, as if reading her thoughts. Grace turned to find Mrs. Holloway watching her with knowing eyes. "I don't know what you mean," Grace replied, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Mrs. Holloway smiled kindly. "Preston. He rides into town for supplies on Saturdays, but he avoids gatherings like this like they're a rattlesnake pit." She patted Grace's arm. "If you're looking to thank him again, you'll likely find him at the general store around 4. That's when he usually comes in, after most folks have gone home for supper preparations." "I wasn't," Grace began, then sighed at Mrs. Holloway's skeptical expression. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been watching people as long as I have," the older woman assured her. "There's nothing wrong with wanting to thank the man who saved your life, or with finding him interesting." "It's not proper," Grace murmured, mindful of the other women nearby. "He's paid for my room and board, helped me secure this position. People might think." "People will think what they want to think," Mrs. Holloway said pragmatically, "but in my experience, it's better to speak your piece than to regret silence later." With that enigmatic advice, Mrs. Holloway moved off to refill teacups, leaving Grace to ponder her words. When the tea finally concluded, Grace found herself watching the clock with embarrassing attentiveness. At 4:15, she excused herself, claiming a need to finish settling into her cabin before dark. If Mrs. Holloway saw through the excuse, she was kind enough not to comment. The general store was quiet when Grace entered, just Mr. Peterson behind the counter and an elderly woman examining fabric bolts in the corner. No sign of Preston. Grace pretended to browse, examining jars of preserved goods and packets of seeds with false interest. The bell over the door jingled and Grace looked up, her heart quickening. But it was only the blacksmith's apprentice, come to purchase nails. Feeling foolish, she selected a small jar of honey, a modest luxury for her new home, and approached the counter. "Settling in all right, Miss Jameson?" Mr. Peterson asked kindly as he wrapped her purchase in paper. "Yes, thank you. Everyone has been so welcoming." "That's Sweetwater for you. Small town, big hearts." He handed her the package. "We're mighty glad to have a proper teacher again. My youngest, Timothy, has been running wild since Miss Winters left." Grace smiled. "I look forward to meeting him on Monday." As she turned to leave, the bell jingled again. This time, Preston stepped through the door, removing his hat as he entered. He paused when he saw her, surprise flashing briefly across his features before he composed himself. "Miss Jameson," he greeted her with a nod. "Mr. Vale," she returned, suddenly unsure of what to say now that he was actually before her. "How nice to see you." "Just picking up some supplies," he explained unnecessarily, gesturing vaguely toward the counter. "How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you. Everyone has been exceptionally kind." She hesitated, then added, "I've moved into the teacher's cabin today." "Good, that's good." Preston seemed equally at a loss for words, an unusual state for someone normally so composed. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat from behind the counter. "Your usual order's ready, Preston. Just need to add anything else you might want." "Right, thank you." Preston turned back to Grace. "I should let you get on with your evening." "Actually," Grace said quickly, gathering her courage, "I was hoping to speak with you. Perhaps after you've finished your business here." Something flickered in Preston's eyes, surprise perhaps, or wariness. "Of course, I won't be long." Grace nodded and stepped outside to wait, her heart beating unnaturally fast. What was wrong with her? She was a grown woman, not a schoolgirl with her first infatuation, yet something about Preston Vale affected her in ways she couldn't rationalize. The evening was pleasant, with a soft breeze carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Grace stood on the boardwalk, watching as people made their way home for the day, nodding politely to those who greeted her. Sweetwater was beginning to feel familiar already, its rhythm and residents becoming known quantities in her mind. The door opened behind her and Preston emerged, a canvas bag of supplies slung over his shoulder. "Miss Jameson," he acknowledged, settling his hat back on his head. You wanted to speak with me? Yes, Grace took a breath. Would you walk with me, perhaps toward the creek? I've been told it's quite pretty at sunset. Preston studied her for a moment, then nodded. It is. They walked in silence at first, leaving the main street behind and following a well-worn path that led toward the creek that gave the town its name. The water was low this time of year, but still flowed clear and sweet between grassy banks dotted with wildflowers. I wanted to thank you properly, Grace said finally as they reached a small footbridge that crossed the narrowest part of the creek, for everything you've done for me. You've thanked me already, Preston pointed out, stopping to lean against the bridge railing, not adequately. Grace turned to face him directly. You saved my life, Mr. Vale. You carried me for miles through the desert when you could have left me to die. You paid for my lodging when I was destitute. You helped me secure a position and a home. She took a step closer. How does one properly thank someone for all that? Preston looked uncomfortable under her direct gaze and sincere words. I did what anyone would do. No, Grace said firmly, not anyone, you. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. I wanted to give you something. It's not much compared to what you've done, but Preston accepted the package with evident surprise. You didn't need to get me anything? Open it, she encouraged. Carefully, almost awkwardly, he unwrapped the paper to reveal a small book of poetry Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Preston stared at it, then at her, clearly puzzled. It was in Mrs. Holloway's small library, Grace explained. She said I could have it when she saw me reading it, I thought. Given our conversations during the journey here, that you might enjoy it. The way he writes about the open spaces, the essential nature of humanity, it reminded me of things you said. Preston ran his fingers over the worn cover, a complex mix of emotions crossing his face. I haven't read poetry since before the war, he admitted quietly. Perhaps it's time to start again, Grace suggested. He looked up at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new. You're an unusual woman, Miss Jameson. I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Vale, she replied with a small smile. Preston, he corrected automatically. Preston, she echoed. And you must call me Grace, especially now that I'm to be the town's school teacher. It wouldn't do for you to be so formal when everyone else will be using my given name. Grace, he said, and the way he spoke it made it sound like something precious. Thank you for the book. They stood there on the bridge as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the creek and painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Something was happening between them, something undefined but powerful. Grace felt it in the quickening of her pulse, in the way Preston's eyes kept returning to her face despite his obvious attempts to maintain proper distance. I should escort you back, Preston said finally, breaking the spell. It'll be dark soon. Yes, of course, Grace agreed, though she felt a pang of disappointment. She wasn't ready for their time together to end. They walked back toward town in companionable silence, the tension of the moment on the bridge easing into something more comfortable. As they approached the teacher's cabin, Preston slowed his pace. Will you be at church tomorrow? He asked, the question seemingly casual but his tone suggesting it mattered to him. Yes, Grace confirmed. Reverend Thomas was quite insistent that the schoolteacher should set a good example. Perhaps, Preston hesitated, then forged ahead. Perhaps we could walk there together, if that would be agreeable to you. Grace couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. That would be very agreeable. They had reached her door and now stood facing each other in the gathering dusk. Preston held the book of poetry carefully, as if it were something far more valuable than its modest appearance suggested. Until tomorrow, then, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Until tomorrow, Grace echoed. She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the last light of day, and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was beginning here in Sweetwater, something unexpected and potentially wonderful. For the first time since her father's death had upended her life, Grace found herself looking forward to the future with genuine hope. Inside her small cabin, she lit the lamp and moved about the familiar tasks of preparing a simple supper. But her mind remained on the man who had saved her life, and was now, perhaps, saving something else, her heart, which she had thought too practical and too wounded to be stirred again. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed specifically for church-going. Grace dressed with particular care in her best borrowed dress, a navy blue with white collar and cuffs that Mrs. Peterson had generously altered to fit her. She arranged her hair in a neat chignon, secured with borrowed pins, and added Mrs. Holloway's cameo brooch for a final touch of respectability. The knock at her door came precisely at 10:30, making her smile at Preston's punctuality. When she opened the door, she was momentarily taken aback. Preston stood there in a proper suit, not new by any means, but well-maintained and clearly reserved for special occasions. He'd had his hair trimmed and his face was freshly shaved. The overall effect was striking. "Good morning," she greeted him, suddenly feeling shy. "Morning," he replied, his eyes taking in her appearance with evident appreciation. "You look lovely." "Thank you, you look very handsome yourself." The compliment slipped out before she could consider its propriety. A hint of color touched Preston's cheekbones. "This old thing. Only wear it for Sundays and funerals." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" The walk to church was pleasant, with Preston pointing out various landmarks and sharing bits of town history. Grace was struck by how different he seemed today, more relaxed, more talkative. The stiff, reserved man who had found her in the desert was still present in his careful posture and measured speech, but there was a warmth breaking through that hadn't been there before. The church was already filling when they arrived. As they entered together, Grace was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered comments. Clearly, their arrival as a pair was noteworthy. "People are staring," she murmured. "Small town," Preston replied simply. "They'll find something new to gossip about by next Sunday." The service itself was standard Protestant fare, with hymns Grace knew from her Eastern upbringing and a sermon on community and fellowship that seemed particularly pointed given the number of glances Reverend Thomas cast in her direction. After the final prayer, the congregation spilled out onto the church steps for the customary socializing that was as much a part of Sunday as the service itself. Grace found herself surrounded by mothers eager to discuss their children before the school term began, while Preston stood somewhat apart, nodding to various men but not fully engaging in conversation. She noticed how he kept her within his line of sight, his eyes finding her periodically as if to reassure himself of her well-being. "Miss Jameson," Mayor Collins approached, his wife on his arm. "A word, if you don't mind." "Of course," Grace replied, excusing herself from the group of mothers. "Mrs. Collins and I would be honored if you would join us for Sunday dinner," the mayor said warmly. "Nothing formal, just a chance to welcome you properly to Sweetwater." "That's very kind of you," Grace began, then hesitated, glancing toward Preston. Mayor Collins followed her gaze and smiled knowingly. "Preston is welcome too, of course. In fact, I insist upon it." Before Grace could respond, the mayor was already moving toward Preston, extending the invitation with the confident air of a man unused to refusal. She watched as Preston's expression shifted from surprise to reluctance, then resignation as the mayor clapped him on the shoulder with jovial finality. "Looks like we're having dinner with the Collinses," Preston said as he rejoined her, a hint of dry humor in his tone. "Is that a problem?" Grace asked, concerned by his evident discomfort. "Not a problem, just not used to socializing with the town's elite." His expression softened at her worried look. "It'll be fine. Mayor's a good man, just talks a lot." The Collins home was the finest in Sweetwater, a 2-story house with actual glass windows and a wrap-around porch. Inside, the furnishings were modest by Eastern standards, but represented significant prosperity for a frontier town. Mrs. Collins, a plump, pleasant woman with an evident passion for decorative doilies, ushered them into a parlor where several other guests were already gathered, including Dr. and Mrs. Wallace and the Petersons from the general store. "A small gathering of the town council and their spouses," Mayor Collins explained, taking Preston's hat and Grace's shawl. "Thought it would be nice for you to get better acquainted in a social setting." Dinner was a surprisingly elegant affair, with multiple courses served on matched china, a luxury in a town where most made do with mismatched pieces accumulated over years. The conversation flowed easily, centering on town affairs, the upcoming harvest festival, and gentle inquiries about Grace's background and education. Preston said little, but Grace noticed how attentively he listened, occasionally surprising the others with an insightful comment or question that revealed his intelligence and awareness of matters beyond ranching. There was a moment when Dr. Wallace mentioned a recent medical journal article about heat stroke treatments, and Preston asked a question so specific and knowledgeable that the doctor blinked in surprise before launching into a detailed response. "You seem to know a great deal about medicine for a ranch hand, Mrs." Peterson observed Preston's expression closed slightly. "Picked up a few things during the war." The brief silence that followed was broken by Mayor Collins. "Preston's being modest. He was a field medic with the Union Army, saved countless lives from what I hear." Grace looked at Preston with new understanding. It explained his confident care of her in the desert, the knowledge of exactly what she needed to survive heat exposure. Another piece of his mysterious past revealed. After dinner, the men retreated to the mayor's study for cigars, while the women gathered in the parlor. Grace found herself answering Mrs. Collins's gentle but probing questions about her relationship with Preston. "It's nothing improper," Grace assured her, feeling her cheeks warm. "He saved my life. We've become friends." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Collins replied with a knowing smile that suggested she saw more than Grace was admitting. "He's a good man, Preston Vale, keeps to himself mostly, but always the first to help when there's trouble. Been sweet on you since he brought you to town. Anyone can see that." Grace was saved from responding by the return of the men. The gathering concluded shortly afterward, with everyone dispersing to their Sunday afternoon routines of rest or quiet visiting. As Preston walked Grace back to her cabin, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dusty road, a comfortable silence fell between them. It was broken only when they reached her door. "Thank you for accompanying me today," Grace said, turning to face him. "I enjoyed your company." "Likewise," Preston replied, his eyes soft as they rested on her face. "Though I'm not much for fancy dinners and socializing." "You did admirably," she assured him. "I was impressed by your knowledge of medicine." Preston looked away, a shadow crossing his features. "The war taught me things I'd rather not know, but some of it's been useful since." Grace sensed the pain behind his words and resisted the urge to press for details. Instead, she changed the subject. "School begins tomorrow. I'm nervous and excited all at once." "You'll do fine," Preston said with quiet confidence. "Those kids need someone like you, someone who cares about education and sees its value." "Will I see you again soon?" Grace asked, then blushed at her own forwardness. "What I mean is, I know what you mean," Preston interrupted gently. "I'd like that. Maybe next Saturday I could show you some of the countryside around Sweetwater, if you're interested." "I'd like that very much," Grace replied, her heart lifting at the prospect. Preston hesitated, then reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't, he took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Until Saturday, then." "Until Saturday," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. He released her hand reluctantly and touched the brim of his hat in farewell. Grace watched him go, her hand still tingling from his touch, her heart fuller than it had been in longer than she cared to remember. The first week of school passed in a blur of activity. Grace found herself with 27 pupils ranging from 6-year-old Sally Jenkins, who couldn't yet read, to 16-year-old Thomas Rogers, who clearly considered himself too grown for schooling, but whose father insisted he complete basic education before taking on full ranch responsibilities. The challenges were considerable: children at different levels of learning, limited resources, and the ingrained frontier suspicion of book learning as something less practical than hands-on skills. But Grace approached each day with enthusiasm and creativity, determined to win over even the most reluctant students. By Friday afternoon, as she dismissed the children for the weekend, Grace felt a genuine sense of accomplishment. Young Sally was beginning to recognize her letters. Thomas had grudgingly admitted that the history of the Mexican-American War was kind of interesting. And the rest of the class had settled into a routine of learning that, while not perfect, showed promise. As she cleaned the blackboard and straightened the room for Monday, Grace found her thoughts drifting to Preston and their planned outing the next day. She'd seen him briefly in town midweek when he'd come to the general store for supplies, but they'd only exchanged a few words in passing. The prospect of spending hours in his company made her unreasonably happy. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect day for riding. Grace dressed in her most practical borrowed outfit, a simple skirt and shirtwaist that wouldn't be ruined by horseback riding. Mrs. Peterson had promised to help her sew new clothes once her first month's salary was paid, but for now she was still dependent on the generosity of the townswomen. Preston arrived just after 9, leading 2 horses Thunder and a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze on her forehead. "Morning," he greeted her, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "Ready for your tour of the territory?" "More than ready," Grace assured him. "I've been looking forward to it all week." "This is Daisy," Preston introduced the mare. "Belongs to the ranch, but she's got a sweet temperament." "Good for beginners." Grace approached the horse cautiously, holding out her hand for the mare to sniff. "Hello, Daisy, aren't you beautiful?" "You've ridden before?" Preston asked, watching her. "A little in Philadelphia, just in the park, very proper ladies' riding," Grace admitted. "Nothing like your Western riding, I'm sure." Preston's lips quirked in a half-smile. "We'll take it easy, no galloping across the plains today." He helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. The brief contact sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with the excitement of riding. They set off at a leisurely pace, Preston leading the way out of town toward the rolling hills to the west. As the houses of Sweetwater fell behind them, the landscape opened up into a vista of startling beauty, golden grasslands stretching toward distant mountains, the occasional copse of trees marking the course of hidden creeks. "It's breathtaking," Grace said, taking it all in. "So vast and open." "That's what I love about it," Preston replied, watching her reaction with evident pleasure. "The space to breathe, no walls closing in." They rode for an hour or so, Preston pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the region, Apache legends of how the mountains were formed, tales of Spanish explorers who had passed through centuries before, anecdotes about local ranchers and their territories. Eventually, they came to a rise overlooking a small valley where a clear stream wound through a grove of cottonwood trees. "Perfect spot for lunch," Preston announced, reining Thunder to a stop. He helped Grace dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. From his saddlebags, he produced a surprisingly well-planned picnic: cold chicken, bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of preserves, along with a bottle of lemonade. "Mrs. Holloway helped with this," he admitted as they spread a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood. "Said a lady deserves better than jerky and hardtack for a picnic." Grace smiled, touched by the effort. "It looks wonderful, thank you for arranging this." They ate in comfortable conversation, sharing stories of their pasts: Grace's childhood in Philadelphia, her years at seminary school, her teaching experiences. Preston spoke more openly than before about his own background, his strict judge father, his Harvard education, his reluctant entry into law before the war changed everything. "I couldn't go back to that life after what I'd seen," he explained, leaning back against the tree trunk. "The petty concerns of society, the endless rules and expectations, it all seemed meaningless." "So you came west," Grace prompted, "wandered for a while." "Worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the army, tried mining briefly." He smiled ruefully. "Wasn't much good at that last one. Finally ended up in Sweetwater 2 years ago when the Double R needed hands. Longest I've stayed anywhere since the war." "And now?" Grace asked, the question carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. Preston looked at her steadily. "Now I'm finding reasons to stay." The air between them seemed to still, charged with unspoken meaning. Grace's heart quickened as Preston's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, then back to her eyes. For a moment, she thought he might lean forward, might close the distance between them. Instead, he cleared his throat and looked away. "We should probably start back soon. Don't want to keep you out too late." Grace felt a mix of disappointment and relief. Whatever was growing between them deserved time and careful tending, not rushed emotion. "Yes, I suppose we should." They packed up the remains of their picnic and remounted. The return journey was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts, though the silence between them was comfortable rather than strained. As they approached town, Preston spoke. "Would you consider doing this again, maybe next weekend?" "I'd like that very much," Grace replied honestly. "Good." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face. "I would too." And so began a pattern that carried them through the autumn weeks. Each Saturday, weather permitting, Preston would arrive at Grace's cabin with horses ready for an excursion. They explored the countryside around Sweetwater hidden valleys, mesa overlooks, ancient Native American sites with petroglyphs etched into the rock. During the week, Preston would occasionally appear at the schoolhouse after classes, ostensibly to help with maintenance or to deliver firewood as the weather turned cooler. The children quickly became accustomed to seeing the quiet cowboy around, and some of the older boys in particular seemed to find new motivation for their studies when Preston showed interest in their progress. The town noticed, of course. It was impossible not to in a community as small as Sweetwater. But rather than censure, Grace found mostly approval in the glances and comments directed their way. Preston Vale was respected, and the townsfolk seemed pleased to see him emerging from his self-imposed solitude. By late October, as the first frost silvered the grass and the harvest festival approached, Grace realized that she had fallen irrevocably in love with the stoic cowboy who had carried her out of the desert. The realization didn't come as a thunderclap, but as a quiet certainty, a knowledge that had grown alongside their deepening friendship. Whether Preston felt the same, she couldn't be entirely sure. He was attentive and gentle with her, sought her company at every opportunity, and looked at her sometimes with an intensity that made her breath catch. But he had never spoken of his feelings, never attempted to cross the line of propriety between them. The harvest festival would change everything. The entire town turned out for the annual celebration, held in the churchyard and adjacent fields. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family: pies, cakes, roasted meats, and vegetables from the fall harvest. Banners and bunting decorated the area, and a small band of local musicians provided lively tunes for dancing. Grace arrived early to help with preparations, having promised to supervise the children's games in the afternoon. She was arranging prizes for the sack race when she felt rather than saw Preston's arrival. Looking up, she found him watching her from across the yard, hat in hand, dressed in his Sunday best. "You came," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice as he approached. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, "though I'm not much for crowds and celebrations, as you know." "Well, I'm glad you made an exception." Grace finished arranging the small toys and candies that would serve as prizes. "I'm in charge of the children's games until 4. After that, I'm free to enjoy the festivities." "I could help," Preston offered. "With the games?" Grace raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You want to help with children's games? I want to help you," he clarified simply. And so Grace found herself organizing sack races, egg and spoon relays, and apple bobbing contests with Preston at her side, his usual reserve melting away as he entered into the spirit of the occasion. The children responded to him with enthusiasm, especially the boys, who seemed to find new motivation to win when the admired ranch hand was watching. By 4 o'clock, when Mrs. Peterson arrived to take over supervision, Grace was flushed with exertion and laughter. Preston, too, seemed more relaxed than she had ever seen him, his usually solemn face brightened by genuine enjoyment. "You're good with them," Grace observed as they walked toward the food tables. "The children, I mean," Preston shrugged. "Never spent much time around kids before, there." "Honest, I like that." They filled plates with the community's offerings and found seats at one of the long tables. As they ate, friends and acquaintances stopped by to chat, each exchange reinforcing the sense that they were viewed as a pair, a courtship in progress that met with general approval. As twilight approached, lanterns were lit around the dance area and the band struck up a livelier tune. Couples began to take to the cleared space, from young courting pairs to long-married couples. "Would you care to dance?" Preston asked, his voice hesitant but determined. Grace looked at him in surprise. "You dance?" "Not well," he admitted, "but I know the basics, learned as a boy in Boston, though I'm out of practice." "I'd be honored," Grace replied, her heart quickening as he stood and offered his hand. Preston led her to the edge of the dancing area, then turned to face her, one hand at her waist, the other taking her hand in a proper dance position. There was a moment of awkwardness as he found his rhythm, but soon they were moving together in a simple two-step that matched the music. "You're better than you claimed," Grace observed, smiling up at him. "Having the right partner helps," he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. As they danced, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the music, the movement, the growing connection between them almost tangible in the autumn air. When the song ended, Preston didn't immediately release her, and Grace made no move to step away. "Grace," he said, his voice low and intense, "there's something I need to say to you." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Yes, not here." He glanced around at the crowded festival. "Would you walk with me, just for a few minutes?" Grace nodded, and Preston led her away from the festivities, toward the creek where they had first spoken alone. The path was familiar now, worn smooth by their regular walks over the past weeks. When they reached the small footbridge, Preston stopped and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I'm not good with words," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Not when it comes to personal matters, but I need you to know." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "These past months, knowing you, being with you, you've changed something in me, woken something I thought was dead." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "Preston, please let me finish," he interrupted gently. "When I found you in that desert, I was just doing what needed doing. I didn't expect." He looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. "I didn't expect to fall in love with you, but I have, Grace, completely and irrevocably." The tears spilled over then, tracking down Grace's cheeks in the moonlight. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since you carried me to safety, though I didn't recognize it then." Preston's face transformed with a joy she had never seen there before. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss both gentle and fervent, a perfect expression of the feelings they had just confessed. When they finally parted, Preston kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't have much to offer," he said softly, "just a ranch hand's wages and a heart that's yours completely." "That's more than enough," Grace assured him, "more than I ever hoped to find, especially after everything that happened in Philadelphia." Preston straightened, his expression becoming more serious. "If you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly, with marriage in mind." Grace smiled through her tears. "I'd like that very much." They returned to the festival hand in hand, their new status evident to anyone who cared to look. And many did, with knowing smiles and approving nods. The town of Sweetwater had watched their story unfold from the dramatic rescue to this natural culmination, and the community's blessing was palpable in the air around them. As they rejoined the dancing, Preston held her closer than propriety might strictly allow, but no one seemed inclined to comment. This was the frontier, after all, where life was hard and love was precious. A cowboy and a schoolteacher, brought together by chance and desert heat, had found something worth celebrating. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Grace's life. Preston courted her with old-fashioned dignity mixed with genuine affection. There were more rides into the countryside, now with frequent stops for stolen kisses away from prying eyes. There were evenings by her cabin's fire, reading aloud from books they both enjoyed or simply talking about their days. Preston became a regular presence at the schoolhouse, helping with repairs and improvements, sometimes staying to listen as Grace introduced her students to Shakespeare or explain the principles of geometry. The children came to expect his visits, especially when he began bringing interesting specimens from his rides: unusual rocks, pressed wildflowers, once even a turtle shell to enrich their nature studies. As November turned to December and Christmas approached, Grace found herself drawn into the town's preparations for the holiday. The schoolchildren were to perform a nativity play, carols would be sung, and a community dinner was planned. For the first time since her father's death, Grace felt truly part of a community, embraced and valued not just for her skills as a teacher but for herself. One snowy evening, as she and Preston sat by her fire after a simple supper she had prepared, he seemed unusually quiet, preoccupied with something he wasn't sharing. "Is everything all right?" she asked finally, setting aside the essays she had been grading. Preston looked up, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Just thinking." "About," he hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, clearly old but well cared for. "About this." Grace's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a ring, a modest diamond flanked by two small sapphires set in gold. It was old-fashioned but beautiful, clearly a family piece. "It was my mother's," Preston explained, his voice soft with memory. "The only thing of hers I kept when I left Boston. She told me once to give it to a woman who made me feel the way she felt about my father before life and ambition changed him." "Preston," Grace whispered, her heart hammering. He moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hand in his. "I had planned to wait until Christmas, make it more special, but sitting here tonight watching you by the fire, I couldn't wait another day." His eyes, usually so controlled, now shone with emotion. "Grace Jameson, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, with all my heart." Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that spoke of all the love and promise between them. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "When I left the East, I thought I'd spend my life alone, moving from place to place." "And now?" Grace asked, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart. "Now I've found my home," he said simply. "Not in Sweetwater, but in you." The news of their engagement spread through town with the speed that only small community gossip can achieve. By the next afternoon, Grace had received congratulations from nearly everyone she encountered, along with offers of help with wedding preparations. Mayor Collins insisted on hosting an engagement celebration the following Saturday. Mrs. Holloway claimed the right to bake the wedding cake. Mrs. Peterson immediately began discussions about a proper wedding dress. Even the children at school were excited, peppering Grace with questions about whether Mr. Vale would live at the teacher's cabin, and if they would have babies right away, questions that left her blushing but undeniably happy. Preston, for his part, took the attention with better grace than she might have expected, accepting congratulations with quiet dignity and enduring good-natured teasing from the other ranch hands with stoic forbearance. The most surprising reaction came from Mr. Drummond, owner of the Double R Ranch. The elderly widower summoned Preston to his office the day after the engagement became public. "He offered me the foreman position," Preston told Grace that evening as they walked by the creek, their breath frosting in the cold December air. "Johnson's retiring come spring and Drummond wants me to take over." "Preston, that's wonderful," Grace exclaimed. "You've certainly earned it." "There's more," he said, his expression a mix of disbelief and joy. "There's a small house on the property, the old foreman's quarters. Johnson never used it since he's got his own place in town, but Drummond says it's ours if we want it. Needs some fixing up, but it's solid. 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, even a small parlor." Grace stopped walking to look at him, her heart swelling with happiness. "Our own home," Preston nodded, his eyes bright with plans and possibilities. "I'll need to spend more time at the ranch, but it's only 3 miles from town. You could still teach, and I could ride in with you each morning, then back at the end of the school day." "It sounds perfect," Grace said sincerely. The teacher's cabin had served her well, but the prospect of a real home with the man she loved was beyond anything she had dared hope for when she first arrived in Sweetwater. "There's something else," Preston added, a new note of seriousness in his voice. "Something I've been considering for a while now." "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I've been studying, in the evenings when I'm not with you, medical texts that Dr. Wallace lent me, refreshing what I learned during the war, learning new techniques." He paused, seeming unsure of her reaction. "The town needs a proper medical assistant, someone who can help when the doctor's overwhelmed or away. Dr. Wallace thinks I have the aptitude for it." Grace felt a surge of pride and love for this man who continued to surprise her with hidden depths and aspirations. "I think it's a wonderful idea. Your experience as a field medic combined with proper study, you could help so many people." Relief washed over Preston's features. "You don't think it's foolish, a ranch foreman who treats patients on the side?" "I think it's perfectly sensible in a frontier town where medical help is scarce," Grace assured him. "And I think you have gifts that shouldn't be limited to ranching, wonderful as that work is." Preston pulled her close, kissing her with fervent gratitude for her understanding and support. When they parted, snowflakes had begun to fall, dusting their shoulders and hair with delicate crystals. "We should get back," Preston said reluctantly, "before the weather worsens." As they walked back to town, arm in arm against the cold, Grace was struck by how dramatically her life had changed in just a few short months. From near death in the desert to finding love and a future in this small frontier town, it seemed almost like a dream. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "That fate has strange ways of bringing people together," she replied. "If not for the stage robbery, if not for you happening to ride that particular route that day, we might never have met." Preston considered this. "I don't normally believe in fate," he said finally, "but finding you in that desert, it felt like I was meant to be there, meant to find you." "Perhaps we were both lost in our own ways," Grace suggested softly, "and found each other just when we needed to." Preston squeezed her hand through their gloves. "I like that thought." The engagement celebration at Mayor Collins's home was a lively affair, with seemingly the entire town in attendance. Grace, wearing a borrowed dress of deep green velvet that Mrs. Peterson had hastily altered for the occasion, found herself surrounded by well-wishers and women eager to share advice about married life. Preston, uncomfortable as always in social settings, nonetheless remained steadfastly at her side, his quiet presence a reassuring anchor amid the swirl of activity. Whenever their eyes met across a conversation, the love and certainty she found there reaffirmed everything she felt. "When will the wedding be?" Mrs. Collins asked as the ladies gathered in the parlor while the men enjoyed cigars in the mayor's study. "We're thinking Easter," Grace replied. "That gives us time to prepare and for Preston to fix up the house at the ranch. A spring wedding, Mrs. Peterson clasped her hands in delight. "Perfect. The wildflowers will be blooming and we can decorate the church beautifully." "And it gives us plenty of time to finish your wedding dress," Mrs. Holloway added practically. "The material should arrive on next month's supply wagon if the passes stay clear." Grace felt overwhelmed by the generosity and enthusiasm of these women who had so readily accepted her into their community. "You've all been so kind. I don't know how to thank you." "Nonsense, dear Mrs. Collins patted her hand. "We're just happy to see Preston settled with such a lovely bride. He's a good man who's carried burdens alone for too long." "He doesn't speak much about his past," Grace said carefully. The older women exchanged glances. "The war changed many men, Mrs. Holloway said finally. "Some carried their scars on the outside, others on the inside. Preston's the latter kind. But since you came along, there's a light in him that wasn't there before." The conversation shifted to practical matters of housekeeping and managing a home on a ranch, but Grace's thoughts remained on Preston and the healing they had brought to each other's lives. Later, as they walked back to her cabin through the snowy night, Preston seemed unusually thoughtful. "Mayor Collins offered to stand in for my father at the wedding," he said finally. "Since I have no family coming." Grace squeezed his arm. "That's kind of him." "It is," Preston was quiet for a few steps. "I've been thinking about writing to my sister in Boston. We haven't spoken since Father's funeral, but perhaps it's time to mend that fence." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Grace encouraged. "Would you want her to come to the wedding?" Preston considered the question. "Yes," he decided. "Yes, I would. Elizabeth was always the best of us." She married against Father's wishes, a music teacher with no fortune or family connections. Father cut her off, and I didn't stand up for her as I should have, too concerned with my own rebellion. "It's never too late to reconnect," Grace said softly. "That's what you've taught me," Preston replied, stopping to look down at her in the moonlight reflected off the snow. "That second chances are possible, that the past doesn't have to define the future." He kissed her then, in the middle of Sweetwater's Main Street, heedless of any watching eyes. And Grace kissed him back, her heart so full of love that it seemed impossible to contain. Christmas came and went, a joyous celebration marked by the children's nativity play, community carols, and an exchange of modest gifts. Preston gave Grace a beautiful leather-bound journal for her teaching notes and a delicate silver necklace with a small pearl pendant. She gave him a new medical text she had secretly ordered from Denver and a hand-knitted scarf she had worked on during evenings alone. January brought heavy snows that temporarily isolated Sweetwater, but the community pulled together as it always did. School continued, with Preston often accompanying Grace through the deep drifts, ensuring she arrived safely. The evenings were spent planning their future home, their wedding, the life they would build together. By February, Preston had received a response from his sister Elizabeth. A warm letter expressing delight at his engagement and accepting the invitation to the wedding. She would come with her husband and their 2 children, a family Preston had never met. The prospect of reconciliation with his only living relative added another layer of joy to their approaching nuptials. March brought the first signs of spring crocuses pushing through the melting snow, longer days, and warmer temperatures. Preston spent every spare moment working on the foreman's house at the Double R, determined to have it ready for their wedding night. Grace visited whenever possible, helping to choose paint colors and fabrics, planning where their meager furnishings would go, dreaming of the home they would create together. "It's looking wonderful," she told him one Saturday afternoon as they stood in what would be their bedroom, admiring the fresh paint and new curtains they had just hung. "It's not much compared to what you're used to," Preston said, a hint of old insecurity in his voice. Grace turned to him, placing her hands on his chest. "It's perfect, it's ours." She looked around the room, imagining their life together. "I can already see our children playing in the yard, running in from the fields with flowers or interesting rocks to show us." Preston's eyes darkened with emotion as he pulled her close. "Our children," he repeated, the words clearly affecting him deeply. "I never thought I'd have a family of my own." "Well, you'd better get used to the idea, Mr. Vale," Grace teased gently, "because I intend for us to have a houseful." As Easter approached, wedding preparations reached a fever pitch. Grace's dress was completed, a creation of ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simple but elegant. The church was being decorated, the wedding feast planned, and the entire town seemed involved in ensuring the day would be perfect. 2 weeks before the wedding, disaster struck. A telegram arrived for Preston from the Double Artiquette owner, who was in Denver on business. Several prize bulls had been stolen, and the trail led toward the same badlands where the Blackburn gang was known to hide. "Sheriff Jenkins is organizing a posse," Preston told Grace that evening, his expression grim. "As acting foreman, I need to go." Grace felt cold fear settle in her stomach. "The Blackburns are dangerous. They've killed before." "I know." Preston's jaw was set in a hard line. "But those bulls represent a major investment for the ranch, and the men look to me for leadership now. I can't stay behind while others take the risk. When do you leave?" Grace asked, struggling to keep the tremor from her voice. "Dawn tomorrow. With luck, we'll pick up their trail quickly and be back within a few days." Grace nodded, trying to be brave. "Promise me you'll be careful. Our wedding is in 2 weeks, and I expect you to be there, Preston Vale." He gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, he promised. I'll be back before you know it with those bulls and maybe the Blackburns in custody too. That night, as they said their goodbyes at her door, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of foreboding that had settled over her. I love you, she whispered against his lips. Come back to me. Always, Preston replied, kissing her once more before reluctantly pulling away. Keep planning our wedding. I'll be there to make you Mrs. Vale, just as promised. Grace watched him walk away into the darkness, her heart heavy with worry. Despite his confidence, she knew the dangers he faced. The Blackburn gang had eluded capture for months, and they wouldn't surrender their stolen prize without a fight. The next few days were the longest of Grace's life. She taught her classes with forced cheerfulness, trying not to let the children see her concern. In the evenings, she worked on final preparations for the wedding, focusing on practical tasks to keep her mind from dwelling on dangers she couldn't control. On the fourth day after the posse's departure, Grace was at the schoolhouse, reviewing her students' arithmetic exercises when she heard a commotion outside. Looking up, she saw several of the older boys rush to the windows. Miss Jameson? Young Timothy Peterson called excitedly. The posse is back. They're coming down Main Street, Grace's heart leapt. Setting aside her work, she quickly dismissed the class and hurried outside, the children streaming around her in their eagerness to see the returning heroes. A group of dust-covered riders was indeed coming down the street, leading several bulls on ropes. At their head rode Sheriff Jenkins, his weathered face bearing a satisfied expression. Grace scanned the riders anxiously, looking for the one face she needed to see. When she spotted Preston toward the back of the group, relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. He was alive. Dusty, tired-looking, with a bandage visible on his left arm, but alive and whole. As the posse reached the center of town, a crowd gathered to greet them. Mayor Collins stepped forward to congratulate Sheriff Jenkins, and the men began to dismount, clearly ready for rest and celebration after their successful mission. Preston's eyes found Grace in the crowd, and he made his way directly to her, ignoring questions and congratulations from others. When he reached her, he didn't hesitate but pulled her into his arms right there in the street, holding her as if he never intended to let go. You're hurt, Grace said when they finally parted, gently touching the bandage on his arm. Just a graze, Preston assured her. Doctor. Wallace already looked at it. It'll be healed by our wedding day. What happened? She asked, still keeping hold of his hand, unwilling to break contact now that he was safely returned. We tracked them to a canyon about 30 miles south, Preston explained. Caught them moving the cattle toward the Mexican border. There was a firefight. We captured 3 of them, including Digger, but 2 got away. The ones who got away, will they come after you? Grace couldn't help the fear that crept into her voice. Not likely, Sheriff Jenkins interrupted, having approached in time to hear her question. They're running scared, heading for Mexico if they've got any sense. Besides, Digger was the ringleader and he's safely locked up along with his cousins. The sheriff tipped his hat to Grace. Your fiancé here was mighty helpful, madam, kept a cool head during the fight and patched up 2 of our men afterward. Preston looked uncomfortable with the praise, but Grace squeezed his hand, proud of his bravery and skills. I'm just glad you're all back safely. And in plenty of time for your wedding, the sheriff added with a wink. Speaking of which, I'd better let you 2 have some privacy. I'm sure you have a lot to talk about after 4 days apart. As the crowd dispersed, Preston and Grace walked slowly toward her cabin. Now that the immediate relief of seeing him alive had passed, Grace could see how exhausted he was, dust-coated, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes. You need rest, she told him firmly when they reached her door, and a proper meal. Come inside, and I'll fix you something while you tell me everything. Preston didn't argue, following her into the cabin and sinking gratefully into a chair while she busied herself preparing food. As she worked, he recounted the details of the posse's mission, the long days of tracking, the tense confrontation, the successful recovery of the stolen bulls. The ranch hands are heroes now, he concluded with a tired smile. And Drummond will be pleased when he gets back from Denver to find his prize stock safe and sound. And what about you? Grace asked, setting a plate of food before him. "Are you truly all right?" Preston caught her hand, pulling her down to sit beside him. "I am now," he said simply. "Being away from you, knowing what was waiting for me here, it gave me strength I didn't know I had. All I could think about was getting back to you, to our wedding, to the life we're building." Grace leaned forward to kiss him, tasting dust and exhaustion, but also the love that had become the center of her world. "2 more weeks," she whispered against his lips, "and nothing will separate us again." The final days before the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Preston's sister, Elizabeth, arrived with her family, a joyous reunion that brought healing to old wounds and new connections to both their lives. The foreman's house was completed, furnished modestly but comfortably with a combination of items from the general store and handcrafted pieces made by town residents as wedding gifts on the eve of their wedding. As was tradition, Grace spent the night at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house while Preston stayed at the ranch. She lay awake long into the night, too excited to sleep, thinking of the journey that had brought her to this moment. From near death in the desert to new life in Sweetwater, from solitary schoolteacher to beloved bride, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself blessed their union. Grace was surrounded by the women of Sweetwater as she prepared Mrs. Holloway fussing with her veil, Mrs. Peterson adjusting the fall of her dress, Elizabeth Vale Carter arranging the small bouquet of spring wildflowers that Preston had gathered at dawn and sent to his bride. "You look beautiful," Elizabeth told her, stepping back to admire the completed effect. "My brother is a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Grace replied sincerely, "to have found him, to be found by him." The church was filled to capacity when Grace arrived, with Mayor Collins waiting to escort her down the aisle in place of her father. As the small organ began to play and the congregation rose, Grace's eyes found Preston standing at the altar, and everything else faded away. He was watching her with undisguised wonder and love, his usually stoic face transformed with emotion. In that moment, Grace knew with absolute certainty that this man, this complex, honorable, loving man, was the great blessing of her life. The ceremony itself was a simple frontier affair, but no less meaningful for its lack of Eastern formality. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and sure in the hushed church. When Preston placed the simple gold band alongside her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Thomas declared. "Preston, you may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was brief but tender, mindful of their audience yet expressing the depth of feeling between them. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Vale, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with the entire town sharing in their joy. There was dancing and feasting, speeches and toasts, laughter and a few happy tears. Through it all, Preston remained at Grace's side, his hand often finding hers, his eyes frequently seeking her face as if to reassure himself that this happiness was real and lasting. As twilight deepened, they slipped away from the festivities to begin their married life in their new home. Preston insisted on carrying Grace over the threshold, an Eastern tradition that amused the practical frontier folk but seemed important to him. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vale," he said as he set her gently on her feet in their small parlor, lit with lamps they had prepared that morning. "Home," Grace repeated, looking around at the simple but welcoming space they had created together. "It's a beautiful word, isn't it?" "The most beautiful," Preston agreed, drawing her into his arms, "except perhaps for wife." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Grace rested her head on Preston's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy?" he asked, his fingers gently combing through her unbound hair. "Completely," she assured him. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." His arms tightened around her. "When I found you in that desert, I had no idea I was finding my own salvation. You brought me back to life, Grace." "We saved each other," she corrected softly, "and we'll keep doing so every day for all the years to come." In the years that followed, the Vales became pillars of the Sweetwater community. Grace continued teaching until their first child was born, a son they named James, after her father. Preston thrived as the double Articus foreman while also developing his medical skills under Dr. Wallace's guidance, eventually becoming the town's trusted medical assistant. Their family grew with the addition of a daughter, Elizabeth, named for Preston's sister, and later another son, Thomas. Their home expanded too, with rooms added as the family's needs changed. What remained constant was the love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances, a fateful rescue in the desert that had led to a lifetime of happiness. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the desert heat reminded them of their beginning, Preston and Grace would sit on their porch, watching their children play in the yard, and marvel at the journey that had brought them together. From desperate strangers to devoted partners, from isolation to family, from near death to abundant life, theirs was a love story born of adversity and nurtured by shared purpose and deep affection. And when their grandchildren eventually asked how they met, Preston would tell the tale of finding a beautiful woman fainted from heat in the desert, carrying her miles to water and safety. He would describe the courage she showed, the strength she found, and how in saving her, he had ultimately saved himself. Grace would smile at his telling, adding her own memories of waking to find herself in the care of a solemn cowboy whose gentle hands belied his weathered exterior. She would speak of the long journey to Sweetwater, of building a new life amid hardship and hope, of falling in love with the man who had carried her not just to physical safety, but to a lifetime of happiness. It was a story they never tired of sharing, for it reminded them of the fragility and preciousness of life, and of the remarkable ways that love could bloom in the most barren of places. From desert heat to hearth fire, from desperate thirst to the wellspring of lasting love, theirs was a journey that had come full circle, finding its completion in the home and family they had created together in Sweetwater.